So our focus too is somewhat on Drainsville and the Mount Vernon district. So we do have some calls scheduled with some of the supervisors from those areas. So to the extent that any of your work also kind of hones in on those particular areas, that might be of interest to us. But I guess we'll just jump in with some of these questions, and we certainly want this to be a conversation. So we'll make this as conversational in nature as possible. But I'll start off kind of with like a broad question, which is, in your opinion, what are the key features of a livable community? And I know that a lot of your work is around the built community, so I'm sure that will play a big role. So maybe as you're sharing your answer to that, if there are some key projects or initiatives that you are currently focused on or thinking about for the future that kind of tie into that, that would be also pretty cool to hear about.
Yeah, a word that's become very popular of late is placemaking. I don't know if you all hear about that much as we do. I like to call it the three-legged stool, where you link street design or transportation systems with land use and then economic development. That when you think of one, you have to really be thinking of all three, because they can't happen in isolation. Although in a way that's what the suburban model did. Mm-hmm. And we're learning now that while there were some advantages, there were also some challenges, and particularly with younger generations, that they don't like the lifestyle necessarily of the suburban model, where it's auto-dependent, single uses, a little bit isolated, depending on where one lives. And some people like that. They like, having their own home and yard and the quiet. But a lot more what we're seeing now is they want community. They want a mix of uses. They want to be able to walk to different services and products, if you will. And so we were built really on a model back in the 50s of a lot of land, cheap land, and a lot of government money to build the infrastructure, these massive roads that went through Fairfax. And some were new, like the Beltway or the toll road or I-66. Some were old country roads that then became what we call arterials. And so it's kind of a hybrid of a local road or street that turned into a thoroughfare. And it's really hard to create place when your goal is just throughput, to get the cars through. Mm-hmm. And to make sure they don't have to wait long. But then the sacrificial lamb is then the placemaking. Because if you think about Route 29 or Route 7, except Falls Church, because they did a great job of creating Main Street on their Route 7, but in our Route 7, it's just really for throughput. Think about Tyson's and where Route 7 goes through Tyson's, or where it goes through Seven Corners. Mm-hmm. And so we're big part of what I'm trying to reframe is, what are these streets for? Is it to reward the through traveler who just wants to get from point A to B? Or is it to create great streets that are more like Main Street, that build on community, diversity, from a mix of uses to a mix of people, types of people, young, old, variety of ethnicities, whatnot. And that's proving to be one of our biggest challenges, because we don't control our streets. VDOT does. Mm-hmm. And that was actually created during the Depression, believe it or not, in the 30s, when there was a real disparity between the quality of a road that was built up here versus the quality of road that was built in Southwest Virginia, where they still had like dirt roads and whatnot. So the state said, we're going to have an equal playing field. We'll apply the same standard throughout the state, which in some ways made sense, but in other ways didn't, because they're very different places. The rural areas are very different than Northern Virginia. So that's one of the biggest issues that I'm trying to get staff to pay more attention to, that we can't just let VDOT make these decisions and we roll over and play dead. We have to tell them what the other qualities of a street or a road are and how we want that factored in. So it's a bit wonkish, but it's one of the biggest issues we're dealing with.
That's fascinating. I knew that VDOT controlled most of the roads, but the history behind it is very, very interesting. And like so many other things, you kind of see the effects of that now. Back then it made a lot of sense, but now it's not really serving the right purposes that we want, especially around that community concept.
Right.
Rachel, I'm curious, you mentioned so VDOT, and I know that VDOT controls roads here, but I'm not originally from this area. I'm from California, and so like the California Highway, whatever, administration does the highways, but then local roads are just maintained by the local. So can you maybe talk about like some pros and cons of the system here?
It's interesting because the cities in Virginia are locally designed and operated. So they made that deal back in the 30s. And there are two counties. One is Enrico, just north of Richmond, and Arlington. So we have a great example right next door to us where they get to control it. And we see the differences on the quality of their street design versus ours. And in California, they don't operate the local streets either. They manage the interstates, like, I don't know which part you're from, but 880, 980, all those in Northern California, Route 1 all the way down to San Diego. And so some of those go through cities, but the two, the state government and local government need to work together, but otherwise it is under local control. And there's been a lot of talk about doing that in Fairfax, and they study it like every 5 years, and then they say, oh, never mind, it'll cost too much. But I think we need to push that more because we're at a point where we're urbanizing more and more. We're becoming more like a city in many areas, not everywhere in Fairfax, but in many parts. So the big issue is cost. I think there are some people who think it's too much, but I would say we're leaving value on the table by not taking ownership of it, that we could create a whole lot more value.
Interesting. Yeah. Rachel, I kind of jumped around, but I was looking at the various web pages for you. You manage so many different departments, and I'm sure that's just a lot of great work happening under you. So I'd love to hone in on if there are a couple of examples within your departments of that livable community concept. We have been chatting with a lot of folks, and it seems like the conversation around housing keeps rising to the top. Other areas that we have been wanting to hone in on a little more are the parks. I think that's under your jurisdiction. The arts, I know, is kind of outside of your work, but arts are an area as well, and transportation, which you just alluded to right now. So I'm just curious if there are any specific projects. I know ZMOD is a big topic of conversation right now, but maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview of some areas that you feel are going to move Fairfax County in kind of new directions to get closer to that more inclusive, diverse, equitable community that we are trying to make kind of around one Fairfax.
So just to give an overview of my department. So I have the Department of Planning and Development, DPD. It used to be Planning and Zoning, and then it was merged with a very small group called Office of Community Revitalization. And when Fred Selden left, he was the director of DPZ, and Barbara Byron was the head of what we call OCR, Community Revitalization. They merged the two and it became DPD. So now she's director of that. And that's where ZMOD was managed. So they have zoning, they have comprehensive planning, which is the long range view of where Fairfax is going. And then they also have, now they've called it CRDs, Community Revitalization Districts. And there are, I believe, 6 of those. So it's the older suburbs, if you will, the first suburbs in the DC area. So you have Annandale, Bailey's, Seven Corners, the Route 1 corridor, McLean, interestingly, Merrifield, and there's one more. I'm trying to think. There's one more in there, but basically they haven't seen the economic prosperity, with the exception of McLean, that other parts of the county have.
Mhm.
And so they created these, but there really wasn't a lot of authority or real meaningful policy tools. Like, they didn't really give them more money. They said that, or special zoning or anything. They said that you could get through the permitting process a little faster, but you have to look at kind of what moves the needle, and that's just not enough to move the needle. They redid some of the sidewalks and put in street trees and that kind of thing. So there was some money in public works, but wasn't a lot. But then they came up with a new tax incentive that the state allowed, where if you merge 2 or more parcels, because they were having trouble getting people to sell, because these are long-time property owners, and they would have like a half acre here or 2 acres there. So if you could merge these plots of land, then you redeveloped it, you got a tax break. So basically your taxes were frozen at the rate when you developed it. So say the property was worth $1 million, but you invested in it and now it's worth $10 million. So you're taxed at $1 million for 10 years. And we're starting to see some movement now. The first one is just outside of, it's kind of between Bailey's and Seven Corners. It's the Skyline properties. There are 6 kind of high rises, maybe 8 to 10 stories. And there's a developer who bought 3 of them, and he's turning it into live work units. They were all office buildings and senior housing. And the third might be just regular housing. I'll have to check on that one. But he just came in, so he's our first case. So that's a good sign. And we're hoping to see more movement in these other areas. So that's DPD. Then, as you said, there's our own DOT, and their job is to advise VDOT on what we want locally. And that's what I'm trying to push more, is to not just go with VDOT's rules, but have rules that really affect change in Fairfax. Then you've got DCC, which is Department of Code Compliance, and that was created to do enforcement, whether it's blighted properties or people who are out of compliance with their zoning. So it's mostly complaint-based, and you have a neighbor who's doing something you don't think is kosher, so then they call us and they go investigate. Then we have a new department called the Department of Economic Initiatives. So Fairfax always had the EDA, Economic Development Authority, and that was by charter from the General Assembly years ago. A guy named Jerry Gordon ran it for 30-some years. And really his job was just to find big corporations to come to Fairfax. And they did that, mostly along the Dulles corridor, so Tyson's all the way out to the airport, and it's done really well, particularly with Metro going in. But then it became clear that smaller things weren't really getting addressed, so they didn't deal with small business and the needs of them. And most of our businesses in Fairfax are 50 employees or less. Mm-hmm. So while you want the big whales, as we call them, there are a lot of little fish that we need to take care of. And then also with retail, they didn't have a specialty in retail, and that's a whole area unto itself. So when I came a little over 2 years ago, one of my charges was to create this department. And we hired a director named Rebecca Maudry, who's remarkable. And it's a small department. We already had the staff, but it was a bit like herding cats. One was working on an innovation item, one was working on talking to small businesses, one was working on public-private partnerships. So now they're in one department, which is nice, and we're coordinating that more and more. Mm-hmm. One of the projects they're working on is called the Connected Autonomous Vehicle Project. AVs are becoming a bigger thing, and we have our first one in the Mosaic District. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's called Relay.
Yes.
It's a little
Okay.
little engine that could. Yeah. It's autonomous, so there is someone who occupies the vehicle to watch it, and they're experimenting with it. And it's a loop, so it starts at Dunloring and goes down to Mosaic and then loops back. So I think it's on a 15 or 20-minute loop. It's not doing well because of COVID. Picked the worst time to launch something like that, and it was last fall. But we're learning a lot about the vehicle itself. So, for example, it can't read certain things like shadows are tricky for it. It sees a shadow and it thinks it's an object and it slams on the brakes, or even a leaf. And so that's a problem, and everyone kind of goes flying. And then it goes really slow. We thought it should go faster, but we needed National Highway Transportation Authority Associated, called NHTSA, NHTA. They had to approve the speed and everything, so we agreed on 12 miles an hour, but it really should be 25 miles an hour, because what's happening is cars behind it are going around it, and it's confusing little relay. And it's also just risky, because you're in the opposing lane. So we're learning all these things. And we're the first in Virginia to have a public AV. So it's a really big deal. There's a guy named Dale Costello. He's a former DOT director in Loudoun and Virginia Beach. He's been all over the state, and he retired. And my predecessor, Rob Stalzer, knew him. They had worked together somewhere, and said, "Hey, why don't you come up with some crazy innovative idea with transportation?" So Dale said, "Well, let's try this." And I'm telling you, it was a heavy lift. That this was not easy, and he had to, coordinate with Department of Rails and Public Transportation. He got money from them. He had to work with VDOT, VTTI, which is the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. He had to work with Dominion, because they actually bought the vehicle. Easy Mile is the company out of France. So this was not a given. It was kind of a pipe dream, and Dale really made it happen. And he won't take any credit, so don't try and give it to him. So I'm like his heavy, I'm his spokesperson. He's amazing. So that's an example of innovative thing that DEI is working on. But when COVID hit, they were the agency that managed the small business grants. And the board approved like $50 million in grants to really keep these businesses alive. It's a lot easier if a business kind of goes downhill but still exists, to get it back up to speed than to totally stop and restart. Chances are they're not going to. So we're trying to keep these businesses alive. And even a $10,000 or $20,000 grant can really make the difference. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things they work on. Then we have LDS, Land Development Services, where Ellen plays a really key role there. And they basically issue building permits and also handle the inspections. So that's where you go if you want to build something, put an addition on, regrade your lot, whatever it is, anything you're doing to the built environment, you got to go through them. Now they have to coordinate with other departments sometimes. And they have about 350 people in their department. DPD, by the way, has about 150, just to give you a sense of scale, and DEI has maybe 10, if that. So they're all over the place. DCC has about 50. So that's LDS. Then the biggest department I have is Public Works, and that's about 1,000 employees. And so they deal with trash and or solid waste, as we call it. So there's the I-95 landfill, there's the I-66 transfer station where people can bring things and then they take it down to I-95. We do a lot of recycling. I'm sure you've heard about that. From glass to plastic, you could take yard waste, all that good stuff. Then there's the whole water component, whether it's wastewater. So, you use your sink, and that water has to go somewhere, and that's the division that collects that water. They then send it to another division, which is the wastewater treatment plant, and that's at the Noman coal, Noman coal, and that's off of I-95 as well, or actually Route 1. And they treat the water, and then it actually goes into the Potomac, believe it or not. And so we don't supply the water. That's Fairfax water. It's its own authority. So we're not over that, but we obviously have to coordinate. And then we get some of our water from the Occoquan Reservoir. And that's why the land north of the Occoquan River is all, it looks, if you look on a map, looks all green. It's not parkland, but it's 5 acre minimum per house to keep the area wooded green so that the runoff is not, full of silt and erosion and pollutants. So those are our two sources. And then there's something else I'm thinking. Stormwater management, which is becoming a huge issue, more and more. We've learned a whole lot about stormwater management over the decades. And we used to just build something and, oh well, but now we go, no. We have to think about how, when it rains, you've created impervious surfaces, whether it's the roof of a building or a parking lot. And that water's now not going to get absorbed into the earth. It's going to run off into the neighbor's yard and then off to a creek and then off to the river. And there's often sediment and pollutants. So we're working more and more to keep it on the land where it should be absorbed, and then it can run off. So it's quite complex. And the more I learn about it, the more I appreciate all that they do. And these tear downs that are getting done, these little ranchers or little Cape Cods, the builders are tearing them down and building McMansions for these giant houses. It's causing real trouble with runoff because now you've got a roof that's twice the area. And we're getting a lot of complaints from neighbors who still live in that little ranch house and go, what's going on? My backyard's a lake. And so how do you manage that? So that's public works. And then the last one is parks. Now, I'm more of a liaison to the park authority because they're their own authority. They have their own board. That board hires the director. That director reports to the board. But I'm the person who makes sure we all coordinate because park issues relate to all those departments I just talked to you about. And so that's like a half a department, I say. So I have like 6.5 departments. What was your question? I'm joking.
Well, I guess you've mentioned a lot of projects. I'm wondering, are there one or two that you would say, if you were kind of doing your own little ranking of, let's just say you could only pick 2 projects to do in the community that you think would, have the most bang for the buck, the most benefit to building that concept of a livable community that is equitable and how the approaches are put together, is reaching, the diversity of our community. That might be a harder question to answer, but are there any that can rise to the top? Yeah,
it gets back to that transportation issue I brought up. I know it's really wonky and boring. But it really comes down to street design because that's where you start. If you get the right street, you need to decide what you want. If you want a community, you need a street that's walkable. It's got mixed use development, slow speed, get people to come to it, not through it. If you want just throughput, like the Beltway, like I-66, I mean, there is a need for that kind of road, right? But you don't want them going through your areas where you're trying to create community. And again, I use Tyson's as the example, right? Well, we're never going to get rid of the Beltway. It goes pretty much right through Tyson's. Oh, well. But you got 7 and 123, which were old country roads that really started in the 1700s. They're pretty historic, really. 7, it was the Leesburg Pike, right? Started in Leesburg. And if you wanted to get to Alexandria to get to market.
Right near me on Alexandria, Arlington side, yeah.
Yeah, so you took that country road, right? And then 123, you took the chain bridge from Georgetown, DC, you came across. And so we were just the countryside. We never really planned Fairfax. And this is the problem we're seeing now, is that if you look at the history, I have a whole presentation on it if you ever want to hear it, but that's a whole other thing. You know, Alexandria, actually laid out by George Washington, he kind of did everything in America.
He owned a lot of land.
He's a surveyor, he's a farmer, he won wars. No wonder he's famous. So he lays out Alexandria. It's a very different way to develop because you got to get one, like everyone who owns that land to agree, unless you're lucky that it's one person who says, okay, I'm going to lay out this grid. And it was a very typical European grid, and they were done all over Virginia, whether it was Fredericksburg, Richmond, Lynchburg, Stanton. And they created these little grids with mixed-use development. Because think about it, trains hadn't even been invented yet. The only way to get around was by foot or by horse, right? Or by boat, which is why Alexandria is on the water. It was a very active port, and why it's located where it is, because the land comes right down to the river, as opposed to like Mount Vernon, where it's up on the bluff, right? So there's, you know, for estates, that's probably a good location. But if you want commerce, you want, you know, usually it's where water is and access to that water or crossroads, right? And so they had to make it tight and dense and mixed use so that you could live your daily life. Now, if you were on a farm, that's another thing. You have your house on your acreage, and then occasionally you come into the city to sell your product or to buy product. Same with DC, right? Very well planned, very well thought out, a good walkable, mixed use, dense urban grid. We were just farms and forests with country roads that were probably located where Native American paths were or cow paths. Who knows, you know, why they were where they were. Then trains came and we started to get little towns like Vienna, like Herndon, like Clifton. So you have little baby towns. And then when cars came, that was when Fairfax really became a place. But you think about it, thousands of years we developed cities, and it was dense cities, mixed use, and then the countryside. Whether, you know, the Middle East, it's deserts, or whether you're here and it's forested. But because it was the most efficient way to develop. But when the car came, everything could get developed. It was a land grab, really. It was kind of the gold rush. And if you had a farm, your ship had come in, you're like, woohoo, I'm selling this thing, making tons of money. So Pimmit Hills was the first subdivision. It was a farm. And someone just said, I'm going to, you know, the government will build a road to it, like 123. You could get there from 123. We'll widen it. The Beltway's coming. So I'm going to build a subdivision. And then the people who do shopping centers said, we're going to build the Tyson's Corner Center. And that was Lerner. And they built the shopping center. So it was the first time that we isolated land uses. So you lived one place in the subdivision, you worked in the office park, you shopped in the mall. And so the mixed use, Main Street, urban centers, that's why DC started to go downhill. That's why we're probably one of the only countries in the world where we abandoned our cities. And part of it was we had so much land, and we had a lot of government money to build those roads to go out to greener pastures, right? People just wanted, why not have your own house and your own yard? And then you get in your car and you go shop, or you get in your car and you go to work. But now we're realizing it's just not sustainable anymore. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, we really have to be looking again at the three-legged stool. What kind of land uses do we want? And we know we want more dense, mixed-use, walkable land uses, like Mosaic, like Reston Town Center, like Fairfax Corner. So you're seeing them crop up, right? Mm-hmm. But you got to get the formula right. So that's one. Two is providing the right kind of housing at the right price point for people. So one way you do that is that urban mixed-use development, because now you can build more efficiently. And for people who can't afford a house with a quarter-acre, half-acre lot, they could afford a townhouse. You know, those townhouses they're putting in at Mosaic. Mm-hmm. They're even putting them in Tyson's now. A condo. And in some cases, detached houses, but much more closely spaced. And so I think through the type of housing, which we're finding more and more people want, the smaller housing in urban areas, and at the price point, That's right. So one way you get a price point is because it's a smaller house, right? Another way is through government partnerships. So we are building now, the board has said any place where there's county land, we want you to look at building housing. So I don't oversee housing. That's the Department of Housing and Community Development under Tom Fleetwood, he's terrific. So you might want to talk to him. And that is under Chris Leonard, who is head of HHHS, Health and Human something Services, Housing, Health and Human Services, I guess. And so, but we partner a lot with them. So for example, you know that huge parking lot in front of Government Center, probably the biggest parking lot for a government center in the world. And it's just too much. We don't need it all. So
It's empty usually. Well, now it's always empty.
I know. So Walkinshaw, the new board member, said, why don't we put housing there? It's like, good idea. Now we can start mixing the uses, right? Maybe people who live there might work at Government Center, right? Maybe you got some retail on the ground floor and you start to create a there. Because right now it's not a there. It's isolated uses. You have to just drive to the Government Center. You do your business and you drive out, right? But now this could start to create that place. We're looking at places in Tyson's, all over the county where we own land. So it's very exciting. So you can build affordable housing by the housing type, like I mentioned. Also construction type, like prefab houses, modular housing. You save money on construction. And so that gets passed on. It's still a little bit in the experimental phase because it's hard to keep those factories going because you need a constant flow of demand. And it goes up and down and then they can't always survive. So that one's still in the experimental phase, but the idea is a good one. Like, how do we use construction techniques to lower the cost? So that's another way. And then again, the third way is government subsidies or partnerships. So we could even sell our land to a private developer if they'll promise to do a certain amount of affordable housing, right? Or we give it to them, I don't know, at a certain price point where it makes it work. We also have requirements in our zoning ordinance. So that would be the fourth way for them, for every developer to put in a certain percentage of affordable housing. So I'd say transportation and housing are the two biggest things.
I can't remember who we were talking to, I feel so bad, but they had mentioned Mosaic District and said that, same as you know, that a lot of people are wanting more kind of live work areas like that. But then I remember she'd said that it takes a really long time to achieve something like Mosaic District. You know, what are your thoughts on that, and what contributes to the development time for places like that?
Well, it's like a lot of things in life, you know, you just got to work at it. So interestingly, during the relay launch, that was last October, and Jerry Connolly spoke and Chair McKay spoke, and the architect who works for Edens is the developer of that, and they also did the wharf in DC, if you know where that is. So that's what they do, is mixed use, dense, walkable communities. And Jerry Connolly really kind of moved through all the roadblocks. It was owned by a movie theater company. It started as a drive-in theater, it's about 50 acres. And then over time, it became a multiplex. And then he worked with them to get them to sell the land to this developer. So a lot of times that's the government's role, is to help make these things happen. So I think they wanted to, I don't know, maybe expand their theater. And Jerry said, no, I'm not going to approve it because it required rezoning. He goes, but if you do this. So you have to put your shoulder to the wheel, have the idea, and then know who the players are, and then just work at it. So they own a piece of land next to it that's on Gallows. There's a strip shopping center there, just south of Mosaic, southeast, I would say. And then there's a huge storage building, kind of like one of those Iron Mountain storage buildings, and that's another property owner. So at that ribbon cutting, I talked to the architect who works for Edens, and then he said, oh, you should talk to Steve, he's the PM for this. And I said, how can we get phase 2 going? And so we've been pushing and pushing, and at the end of the day, it's often up to that board member, just like it was for Jerry Connolly. Now it's Dahlia Palchak.
Okay.
And she's going to have to, at the again, end of the day, decide if she'll approve the zoning. So they need a certain what's called FAR, floor to area ratio, basically your density, and how much she'll allow. But the entity that it's a corporation that owns that big storage building, they want a certain price for it, and Edens can pay it if they can get a certain density, and then it works out. So we're trying to help somewhat broker it. So they've just submitted some ideas, and we're going to talk to Supervisor Palchik about it. But I think that's how, we need to be proactive. And I don't know that we've done enough of that. I mean, call the people who build these things and get them to do it. If they want to make money, we want to see more of these places. So it can really be a win-win, but just waiting and hoping they'll do it. Again, it's like anything in life, that's one way. But the other is to be proactive. And I think we could be a lot more proactive.
We spoke with someone last week, Rachel, who Cheryl Ann connected us to from the AARP, from their Livable Communities program. And she had some fascinating stats. I can't remember the exact percentage, but something crazy, like the majority, maybe like 80% of people in our country have 2-person households, and yet they have homes. They're living in homes with like 4 or more bedrooms. So there's a discrepancy in the needs versus what our country really needs, and there's a lot of empty bedrooms, so to speak.
Millions, she said.
What was that?
I think she said millions of empty bedrooms.
Exactly. And then you think of the flip side of the homeless issues and challenges like that our country faces. And then, hearing people who can't pay their rent and getting kicked out of their homes and their apartments. But I'm just curious, maybe it's a 2-part question. One, how I know the county does a lot of, there's a lot of surveys that go out to the community, and that tied into the strategic planning process and areas like that. But how, other than surveys, how do you guys typically get the community's input for new projects, whether it's these mixed-use development sites or thinking about how to restructure roadways or any other projects that are going to affect the community? I know there are hearings and things like that, but are there other ways that your department reaches out to the community to get that input?
Oh, yeah, a ton. Yeah, for better or worse. I mean, there are a lot of NIMBYs out there.
Yeah.
We saw that with ZMOD. And I mean, my view is that they said, I got mine. Good luck to you. Keep moving on. Go out to Loudoun, Fauquier County, Prince William. And we can't keep doing that. It's not sustainable. We can't afford it. Number one, look what it's costing to widen 66.
Yeah.
I don't know how many billions, but that's the last time we're going to widen it, by the way, unless we're going to start knocking down whole neighborhoods or people's houses. I mean, this is it. But we're not going to solve for the traffic. What's going to happen by widening it is they're going to build more housing further out. And then we're going to be right back where we started. So it's just not a smart way to do it, but it happens. And it's a democracy, so everyone's opinions get heard. But we're also engaging with younger generations. You might notice that at these community meetings or public hearings, a lot of older white folks are coming out speaking. If you listen to the ZMOD public hearing that the board had, it was 5 hours and 70 speakers. And the large percentage were old white folks. And they have time, and they also have an investment because, they're protecting their investment, but it's, it would be interesting to ask them, well, where are your kids living? Where are your grandkids living? And how's this going to work? So one of the more contentious items was the ALUs, accessory living units. And they just went nuts over that. And it's always about cars and traffic and parking, always, which is why we need to deal with transportation. Because the more people who walk, that's not a problem. Like in New York, you don't hear about traffic concerns in Manhattan, just because hardly anybody owns a car and you just walk, right? But in a car-dependent place like ours, that's the number one thing that's going to come up, always. And the solution is not to just keep widening, because we're inducing more traffic. We're getting people to, if you make it cheap and easy, they're going to use it, right? So we have to start putting constraints on and inducing biking and walking. And so fortunately the board passed it 7-3 ZMOD, and what it allows is you can by right put a unit in your basement or attic. That's an apartment unit. You don't have to go to the BZA. Now there are certain requirements around parking, of course, that you has to fit on in your driveway or something, because people were concerned about on-street parking. But what this will do from an equity and affordability standpoint, it'll allow people who otherwise couldn't live in these neighborhoods, and they'd have to go further out, or live in DC or something if they want an apartment. So they can live in neighborhoods that were never accessible, which is nice, because then you mix up the neighborhoods, they're more diverse. You give income to the people who own the properties. So now someone who maybe couldn't have afforded to buy that house can, because they're getting whatever, $1,000 a month for a unit. So that helps pay the mortgage. So there are many positive aspects, but if you listen, I know it's 5 hours, but if you listen to it, even an hour, you'll get the tone of what was happening. But what was nice was that younger people are starting to speak out more, and we had to reach out to them. When a survey was done, speaking of surveys, like the older people, almost all said no. The younger people almost all said yes, because it's their future, right? And not to say that all older white people didn't support this, because some of them did. But the chair of the board, Jeff McKay, really pushed to create a new committee called the Young Adult Advisory Council. Yay, we call it. Yay. And you have to be 12. No, I'm joking. You got to be under 35, and it's very diverse. It might be worth listening in to one of their meetings. And so they came out with an opinion to say we support the ALUs as a council. And boy, did that piss off some of the NIMBYs. Like, what are you talking about? Did you talk to every young person in our area? Like, no, did you? And so it really showed that they're pushing the envelope and wanting change and new types of development. And a lot of times with that kind of change, you're going to get pushback, but it means you just keep working at it, keep talking about it. Communication, can agree to disagree, and at the end of the day, the board votes. But I got to hand it to the board; they hung in there, and I would say probably 70-75% were anti, and 25% were supportive. And they, like environmental groups who spoke up, equity groups, again, young folks, people who kind of get the whole smart growth point. So it was nice to see. I mean, that was a real, I don't think we would have gotten that before, that kind of number. So we do a lot of outreach. You leaving?
I have to leave. I have to go do my day job.
Okay, bye, Ellen.
We'll see you soon. Take care. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Rachel, does the county make use of eminent domain? I have no idea here.
It can. It doesn't often. It will for road widening, surprise.
Okay.
But if it's for other things, it's really tough. Really, because it's like the last straw.
Yeah.
You really only do it for infrastructure. Like we're up in Tyson's, they need to expand the pump station because Tyson's is growing, right? And there's a private piece of property right next to our pump station, which is too small. And they'll probably be a willing seller, but if they weren't, we would have the right to take it.
I see.
Yeah, but it's usually the last straw. Usually we can work it out with the owner.
Okay.
Rachel, I was curious if there are, like maybe with ZMOD as an example, or other projects you're working on, are there other parts of the places, other cities or other counties that I mean, Fairfax County is obviously a model to so many, but I'm curious if you all look to other places for inspiration
Oh, yeah.
or ideas, and,
Yeah.
and are there any particular places that are similarly situated?
Mm-hmm. So like Montgomery County, they did an ALU a few years ago. So I met a woman who was a planner for that, and they did a lot of research after they passed it because, you know, everyone's like, oh my God, the world's going to fall apart and my neighborhood's going to go to hell. So they researched it and they looked at every neighborhood and they're like, nope, world didn't fall apart. It was actually pretty good. And they said, you know, there'll be thousands of these. No, you know, there are probably a few hundred in a county of 1 million people, right?
Mhm.
So all these things they said would happen didn't happen. And then they actually then loosened it even more. So we're not going to allow, you know how you'll have like an in-law house in the back, a little building?
Mhm.
You can only do that, ZMOD only allowed that if you have a 2-acre lot. That's a pretty big lot.
Yeah.
My guess is they're going to see that it's okay, and maybe they'll come back and maybe it's a 1-acre lot, and then a half-acre lot, and then a 1/4 acre. So that's what Montgomery County did. So we looked there. We also looked at other cities throughout the country. But what's interesting for people who just don't want it, they, you know, like, say you looked at Des Moines, Iowa, and they'll go, well, we're not Des Moines, Iowa. Why are you looking at that? So you get a little bit caught in that, or they'll even say, we're not Montgomery County, you know. And so it depends who your audience is. Like people who are serious about really listening and implementing this change, they will want that information. But the people who are just dead set against it,
Doesn't matter.
no.
Mhm.
It's fascinating.
No.
I think for one of the LFI days, we had to read a case study about, it was the case where the guy was running like a Buddhist temple or
just like
something.
yeah.
I don't know. That was a big thing a few years back. A zoning issue of whether or not that was he was allowed to have this sort of
Right.
worship place, but it was on his home property, and people in the neighborhood complained. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of those types of challenges, I'm sure, come up every now and then.
Yeah. That happens a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess we're almost at the hour, but just any last thoughts you have? I mean, how, the pandemic has clearly shaped so much of the work we do and kind of rethinking our approaches. And, I'm thinking of like the transportation's been so much better due to the pandemic because not as many people are driving, picking up again. And people, I think too, in the housing piece of it, people are looking for different types of outdoor living spaces to have access to rather than being cooped up in the city. So I think we're seeing more people kind of leaving the city. So I'm wondering what within those areas and others, how do you think the pandemic will sort of change how we approach our work or continue to do the same thing?
We think that, so I used to work for Google, and they were teleworkers before this whole thing. I remember my first day. I was like, where is everyone? And they just trust that you're going to do your job and that whether you do it from home or not. They were always doing Zoom. It was a whole new concept to me. But at the same time, people do come in. It's just more what they want to do. And what I've heard is that they're going to require people starting in September to come back 3 days a week. And it's up to you what those 3 days are. But they want to make sure they keep the office cohesion, the communication, that, we all work together. We're not just on a Zoom. So I thought that was an interesting way. And I think that is how we'll at least start, the first year or two. I think it's probably going to be, I would say a third of the employees will just want to telework and keep teleworking. And it'll depend where they work and what the company requires. But that will affect office space and how much we need. Mm-hmm. The downside is that it might mean people will live further out because they don't have to commute as much. And you really want to get people to live as close to where they work. So it's the jobs housing relationship, right? Mm-hmm. The more you can create housing where the jobs are and jobs where the housing is, the better it is for everyone. It's better for the environment. It's better for our health. It's good for communities. And again, it's what we see younger generations wanting. Interestingly, it's not just younger generations. Like Z, I guess, is the last. Y would be millennials. So those two are the strongest, and now millennials are becoming the biggest population group. So you got to look at the data, like who's out there, what are the needs when you're a 30-year-old versus a 40-year-old versus a 50-year-old. So you got to look at the data. Are they buying cars? Some aren't getting licenses. They don't want to drive. They don't want to own a car. They say that owning a car is about 10 to 15,000 a year. Well, if you don't have a car, look at the money you can put into your housing, right? So you just make trade-offs. In '08, there was a big drop in number of cars per household, and a lot of them didn't go back like a 2-car per household. They stuck to 1. They changed their patterns. How do you affect people's behavior on how they travel? So I am a little worried that they might go further out, and then have we really solved for things? But cities always do well in the end. We always worry about it, like, oh my God, the demise of the city. It's like, no, cities, that's where commerce takes place. You know, we're social animals. That's, you know, that's where people want to be and go. But what's interesting is the baby boomers, empty nesters, now want to be in cities, in urban areas. They want to be in places like Tyson's. We're seeing that a lot. Places like Mosaic, because they want to be able to walk around. They don't have to get to work anymore. They don't have the kids. They want to downsize. They can cash in on their house. And so it's these two groups, right? That each end of the barbells, right? And so that's a good thing. And we also see it's tied to education. They often want to be in a college town where they can take classes, where they can go to concerts, theater, where there's culture, right? So I see those. I think that's a good thing. And the other interesting thing was when our roads were less congested, pedestrian and bicycle accidents went up. They're up throughout the country. And the same with Fairfax, because there was less traffic, so cars were going faster. And it's speed that affects safety. Slow the speed. That's why you want to design the street right? But VDOT, their philosophy is, you know, you want to keep the cars moving. That's throughput. And that's the big thing we're trying to shift. So we're learning a lot about street design because of COVID and the spiking in auto accidents.
Wow.
So we don't really know how the story ends. We keep thinking we do. Like, everyone's going to leave the city. Like, no. Plus, rents have gone way down in cities. So believe me, younger people are going back there, and, you know, ownership has gone up because nobody was moving. And so the supply wasn't there. So when there's not enough supply, prices go up. But rent, because kids were moving back with their parents, why pay rent if I don't have, or for whatever reason, but they'll go back. They will.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We could talk to you all day. It's areas that I do not know much about, so love hearing your perspectives. And
Sure. Thanks for asking.
Thank you for joining Cheryl, Ann, and I today. And I'll send you a hold on your calendar if it is, or I'll send you the date and the time frame. So if it is something you're interested in and have the availability, maybe you could just put a little hold there, and we're still in the kind of early stages of gathering input and figuring out how we're kind of shaping the theme. But I think if we do go into the transportation area, you would be a great fit for be a speaker or on a panel or something. So we'd love to circle back.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to help. Thanks for asking.
Of course. Well, keep up the good work, and I hope you have a great week, and we'll definitely be in touch soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nice meeting you both.
You too. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.